Chapter 14. When those days at Prescott were over and Mr. and Mrs. Manning had left their camp in Granite Basin, Kitty Reed returned to Williamson Valley reluctantly. She felt that with Phil definitely out of her life, the last interest that bound her to the scenes of her girlhood was broken. Before many weeks, the ranch would be sold. A Prescott agent had opened negotiations for an eastern client who would soon be out to look over the property, and Mr. Reed felt, from all that the agent had said, the sale was assured. In the meantime, Kitty would wait as patiently as she could. To help her, there would be Helen's visit, and there was her friendship with Professor Parkhill. It was not strange, considering all the circumstances, that the young woman should give her time more generously ever to the only person in the neighborhood, except Patches, perhaps, who she felt could understand and appreciate her desires for the higher life of which her own parents had been ignorant. And the professor did understand her fully. He told her so many times every day. Had he not given all the years of his little life to the study of those refined and spiritual truths that were so far above the comprehension of the base and ignorant common herd? Indeed, he understood her language. He understood fully why the sordid, brutal materialism of her crude and uncultured environment so repulsed and disgusted her. He understood more fully than Kitty herself, in fact, and explained to her clearly that her desires for a higher intellectual and spiritual life was born of her own rare gifts, evidence beyond all questions the fineness and delicacies of her nature. He rejoiced with her, with a pure and holy joy, that she would so soon be set free to live amid the surroundings that would afford her those opportunities for the higher development of her intellectual and spiritual powers which her soul was craving. All this he told her from day to day, and then one afternoon he told her more. It was the same afternoon that Patches had so unexpectedly found Helen and Stanford in their Granite Basin camp. Kitty and the professor had driven in the buckboard to Simmons for the mail, and were coming back by the road to the Cross Triangle when the man said, "Must we return to the ranch so soon? It's so delightful out here where there's no one to intrude with their vulgar commonplace and mar our companionship." "Why, no," returned Kitty. "There is no need for us to hurry home." She glanced around. "We might sit over there under those cedars on the hill, where you found me with Mr. Patches that day, the day we saw Yawkby Joe, you remember." "Well, if you think it's quite safe to leave the vehicle," he said, "I'll be delighted." Kitty tied the horses to the convenient bushes at the foot of the low hill, and soon they were in the welcoming shade of the cedars. "Miss Reed," the professor began with much gravity, "I must confess that I've been rather puzzled to account for your presence here that day with such a man as that fellow Patches. You'll pardon my saying so, I'm sure, but you must have observed my very deep interest in you. I also chanced to see you with him one day in Prescott in the park. You don't mind me speaking of it?" "Not at all, Professor Parkhill," Kitty returned, smiling as she thought of how ignorant the professor was of the cowboy's real character. "I like Patches. He interests me very much, and there's really no reason why I should not be friendly with him. Do you think I should not be friendly with all of our cowboys?" "I suppose," the professor sighed. "But it hurts me to see you with anything whatever is common with such a man. It shocks me to know that you must in any degree come in touch with such fellows. I shall be very glad indeed when you're free of such kindly obligations and safe from those amongst your own class." Kitty found it very hard to reply. She did not wish to be disloyal to Patches and her many Williamson Valley friends, nor did she like to explain how Patches had played a part for the professor's benefit, for she felt that by not exposing the deception she had, in a way, been a party to it. So she said nothing, but seemed to silently weigh the value of her learned companion's observations. At least, it so appeared to the professor, and in her ready acceptance of his implied criticism of her conduct, he found the encouragement he needed for what followed.
You must understand, Miss Reed, that I've become exceedingly zealous of your welfares. In these months that we've been together, your companionship, your spiritual and intellectual companionship, I should say, has been very dear to me. As our souls have communed, I've felt myself uplifted and inspired. I've been strengthened and encouraged as never before to climb on towards the mountain peaks of pure education. If I'm not mistaken, you have, too, felt a degree of uplift as a result of our fellowship, have you not?
Yes, indeed, Kitty answered sincerely. Our talks together have meant much to me, more than I could tell. I'll never forget this summer. Your friendship has been a wonderful influence in my life. The little man moved uneasily and glanced timidly around.
I'm glad to know that our friendship has not altogether been distasteful to you. I felt sure that it wasn't, but I'm glad to hear you confirm my opinion, and it enables me to say which for several weeks have been weighing heavily on my mind.
Kitty looked at him with the manner of a trusting disciple waiting for the gems of truth that were about to fall from the lips of the venerable teacher.
Miss Reed, why need our beautiful, mutual, profitable companionship cease?
I fear I don't understand, Professor Parkhill, she answered, puzzled by his question. He looked at her with a shade of mild, very mild rebuke as he returned,
Why, I think that I've stated my thought clearly. I mean, I'm very desirous of our relationship. The relation which we have both found so helpful should continue. I'm sure that we have, in these months which we've spent together, sufficient evidence that our souls vibrate in perfect harmony. I need you, dear friend. Your understanding of my soul's desires is so sympathetic. I feel that you complement and fill out, as it were, my spiritual self. I need you to encourage, to inspire, to assist me in the noble work to which I am devoted all my strength.
She looked at him now with an expression of amazement.
Do you mean?
She faltered in confusion while the red blood colored her cheeks.
Yes, he answered confidently. I'm asking you to be my wife. Not, however, in the common vulgar understanding of the relationship. I'm offering you, my dear friend, that which is vastly higher than the union of a mere animal, which is based wholly upon the pure physical and material attraction. I'm proposing marriage of our souls, a union, if you please, of our higher intellectual and spiritual selves. I feel, indeed, that by these higher laws, which the vulgar and beast-like minds are incapable of recognizing, we are as one. I sense, as it were, that oneness which can exist only when two souls are mated by the great Oversoul. I feel that you are already mine, and that I am, that we are already united in spiritual union, that is.
The young woman checked him with a gesture which, had he interpreted it rightly, was one of repulsion.
Please stop, Professor Parkhill, she gasped in a tone of disgust.
He was surprised and not a little chagrined.
Am I to understand that you do not reciprocate my sentiment, Mrs. Reed? Is it possible that perhaps I've been mistaken?
Kitty turned her head as though she could not even bear to look at him.
What you ask is impossible, she said in a low tone. Impossible.
Strive as she might, the young woman could not altogether hide her feeling of abhorrence. And yet, she asked herself, why should this man's proposal arouse in her such egotism and such repugnance? He was a scholar, famed for his attainments in the world of the highest culture. As his wife, she would be admitted at once into the very inner circle of that life to which she aspired, and for which she was leaving her old home and friends. He had couched his proposal in the very terms of the spirituality and intellectual intellect. He had declared himself in that language which she was so proudly thought that she understood, and in which she had so often talked with him. And yet she was humiliated and ashamed. It was to her as though, in placing his offer of marriage upon the high, pure ground of spiritual union, he had insulted her womanhood. Kitty realized wonderingly that she had not felt like this when Phil had confessed his love to her. In her woman heart she was proud and glad to have won the love of such a man as Phil, even though she could not accept a cowboy as her mate. On that very spot, which the professor had chosen for his declaration, Patches had told her that she was leaving the glorious and enduring realities of life for vain and foolish bubbles, that she was throwing aside the good grain and choosing the husks. Was this what Patches meant? She wondered.
I regret exceedingly, Mrs. Reed, the professor said, that the pure and lofty sentiments which I have voiced did not seem to find a like response in your soul.
Again she interrupted with a gesture of repulsion.
Please do not say any more, Professor Parkhill. I fear that I'm very human after all. Come, it's time we return to the house.
All through the remaining hours of that afternoon and evening, Kitty was disturbed and troubled. At times she wanted to laugh at the professor's ridiculous proposal, and again her cheeks burned with anger, and she could have cried in her shame and humiliation. And, with it all, her mind was distraught by the persistent question. Was it not the professor's conception of an ideal mating the legitimate and logical conclusion of those very advanced ideas of culture which he represented, and which she had so admired? If she sincerely believed the life represented by the professor and his kind was so superior, so far above the life represented by Phil Acton, why should she not feel honor, instead of being humiliated and shamed by the professor that she could not call it love? If the life which Phil had asked her to share was so low in the scale of civilization, if it were so far beneath the intellectual and spiritual ideals which she had formed, why did she feel so honored by the strong man's love? Why had she not felt humiliated and ashamed that Phil should have asked her to mate with him? Could it be, she asked herself again and again, that there was something, after all, superior to that culture which she was so truly thought stood of the highest ideals of the race? Could it be that in the land of Granite Mountain there was something, after all, that was superior to the things which she had been taught, as Granite Mountain itself was superior to the primitive strength and enduring grandeur to the man-made buildings of her school? It was not strange that Kitty's troubled thoughts should turn to Helen Manning. Clearly, Helen's education had led to no confusion. On the contrary, she had found an ideal love and a happiness such as every true, womanly woman must, in her heart of hearts, desire. It was far into the night when Kitty, wakeful and restless, heard the sounds of the horse's feet. She could not know that it was Honorable Patches riding past on his way to the ranch on the other side of the broad valley meadows. Weary in body, and with mind and spirit exhausted by the trials through which he had passed, Patches crept to his bed. In the morning, when he delivered the message, the dean, seeing the man's face, encouraged him to stay for the day at the ranch. But Patches said no. Phil was expecting him, and he must return to the outfit in Granite Basin. As soon as breakfast was over, he set out. He had ridden as far as the head of Mint Wash and had stopped to water his horses and to refresh himself with a cool drink and a brief rest beside the fragrant, mint-bordered spring, when he heard someone riding rapidly up the wash the way he had come. A moment later, Kitty, riding her favorite Midnight, rounded a jutting corner of the rocky wall on the bluff. As the girl caught sight of him, there beside the spring, she waved her hand in greeting, and the man, as he waved his answer, and watching her ride towards him, felt a thrill of gladness that she had come. The strong, true friendship that began with their very first meeting, when she had been so frankly interested in the tenderfoot and so kindly helpful, and which had developed so steadily through the year, gave him now a feeling of comfort and relief. Wearied and worn by his disappointment, and with his struggle with himself, with the cherished hope that had enabled him to choose and endure the hard life of range brought to a sudden end, with its life it suddenly so empty and futile, he welcomed his woman friend with a warmth and gladness that brought a flush of pleasure to Kitty's cheek. For Kitty, too, had just passed through a humiliating and disappointing experience. In her troubled frame of mind, and in her perplexing and confused questioning, the young woman was as glad for the companionship of Patches as he was glad to welcome her. She felt a curious sense of relief and safety in his presence, somewhat as one who, walking over uncertain bogs or treacherous quicksands, finds, all at once, the solid ground.
"I saw you go past the house," she said when she reached the spring where he stood waiting, "and I decided right then that I'd go along with you to Granite Basin and visit my friends and the Mannings. They told me that I might come this week, and I think they have quite enough honeymooning anyway. You know where they're camped, do you?"
"Yeah," he answered. "I saw them yesterday. But come on, get down and cool off a bit. You've been riding some, haven't you?"
"I wanted to catch you as soon as I could," she laughed, as she sprang lightly to the ground. "And you see you gained a good start while I was getting midnight salad. What a pretty spot. I must have a drink of that water this minute."
"Sorry, I have no cup," he said. Then he laughed with the pleasure of a good companionship as she answered,
"You forget that I was born to the customs of this country."
And throwing aside her broad hat, she went down on the ground to drink from the spring, even as he had done. As the man watched her, a sudden thought flashed into his mind, a thought so startling, so unexpected, that he for a moment was bewildered.
"Talk about the nectar of the gods!" cried Kitty with a deep breath of satisfaction as she lifted her smiling face from the bright water to look up at him, and then she drank again. "And now, if you please, sir, you may bring me some of that watercress. We'll sit over there in the shade, and who cares whether Granite Basin, the Mannings, and your fellow cowpunchers are 15 or 50 miles away?"
He brought a generous bunch of the watercress, and stretching himself full length beside her as she sat on the ground under a tall sycamore. He laughed. "We seem to lack only the book of verses, the loaf, and the jug. The wilderness is here, all right, and there's a perfectly good bough up there, and of course you could furnish a song. I might recite 'The boy stood on the burning deck,' but alas, we haven't even a flask and a biscuit."
"What a pity that you should be so near yet so far from paradise," she retorted quickly, and then added with a mischievous smile, "Well, it just so happens I have a sandwich in my saddle pocket."
"Well, won't you sing? Please do," he returned with an eagerness that amused her. But she shook her head reprovingly.
"We still lack the jug of wine, you know, and really, I don't think that paradise is for cowpunchers anyways, do you think?"
"Evidently not," he answered, and at her jesting words a queer feeling of rebellion possessed him. Why should he be condemned to years of loneliness? Why must he face a life without the companionship of a mate, If the paradise he had sought so hard to attain were denied him, why should he not still take what happiness he might? He was laying flat on his back, his hands clasped beneath his head, watching an eagle that wheeled, a tiny black speck, high under the blue arch of the sky. He seemed to have forgotten his companion. Kitty leaned towards him and held a sprig of watercress over his upturned face. "I haven't a penny," she said, "but I'll give you this." He sat up quickly. "Even at that price, my thoughts might cost you too much. But you haven't told me what you've done with your dear friend the professor. Haven't you a guilty conscience, deserting him like this?" Kitty held up both hands in a gesture of dismay. "Don't, Patches. Please don't. If you only knew how good it was to be with a man again." He laughed aloud in a spirit of reckless defiance. "And Phil is over there in Granite Basin. I neglected to tell you that he knows the location of the Manning camp as well as I." Kitty was a little puzzled by the tone of his laughter and by his words. She spoke gravely. "Perhaps I should tell you, Patches. We've been good friends, you and I and Phil." "Yes," he said. "Phil is nothing to me, Patches. I mean—" "You mean in the way he wanted to be?" He helped with a touch of ready eagerness. "Yes." "And have you told him, Kitty?" Patches asked gently. "Yes, I have told him," she replied. Patches was silent for a moment, and then, "Poor Phil," he said softly. "I understand now. I thought that was it. He's a man among thousands, Kitty." I know," she returned as though dismissing the subject, but it simply can't be." Patches was looking at her intently with an expression in his dark eyes that Kitty had never seen before. The man's mind was in a whirl of quick excitement. As they had talked and laughed together, the thought that had so startled him, when her manner of familiar comradeship had brought such a feeling of comfort onto his troubled spirit, had not left him. From that first moment of their meeting a year before, there had been that feeling between them of companionship, a feeling which had grown as their acquaintance had developed into an intimate friendship that had allowed him to speak to her as he had spoken that day under the cedars on the ridge. What might that friendship not grow into? He thought of her desire for the life that he knew so well, and how he could, with the granting every wish of her heart, yet protect her from the shames and the falsenesses. And with these thoughts was that feeling of rebellion against the loneliness of his life. Kitty's words regarding Phil removed the barrier, as it were, and the man's nature, which prompted him so often to act without pausing to consider, betrayed him into saying, "Would you be greatly shocked, Kitty, if I were to tell you that I'm glad? That while I'm sorry for Phil, I'm glad that you've said no to him?" "You're glad? Why?" she said wonderingly. "Because now I'm free to say what I could not have said had you not told me what you have. I want you, Kitty. I want you to fill your life with beauty and happiness, and one with contentment. I want you to go with me to see and know the natural wonders of the world and the wonders that men have wrought. I want to surround you with the beauties of art and literature, with everything that your heart craves. I want you to know the people whose friendship would be a delight to you. Come with me, girl, and be my wife, and together we can find, if not paradise, at least a full and useful and contented happy life. Will you come, Kitty? Would you come with me?" As she listened, her eyes grew big with wonder and delight. It was as though for some good genie had suddenly opened wide the way to an enchanted land. Then the gladness went swiftly from her face, and she said doubtfully,
You're joking with me, Patches."
As she spoke his cowboy name, the man laughed aloud. "I forget that you don't even know me. I mean, you don't even know my name."
"Are you some fairy prince in disguise, Sir Patches?"
"Not a fairy, dear, and certainly not a prince, just a man, that's all. But a man, dear girl, who can offer you a clean life, an honorable name, and all of which I have spoken. But I must tell you. I always knew that I would tell you some day, but I did not dream it would be today. My name is Lawrence Knight. My home is in Cleveland, Ohio. Your father can easily satisfy himself to my family and my own personal life and standing. It is enough for me to assure you now, dear, that I am abundantly able to give you all that I have promised." At the mention of his name, Kitty's eyes grew bright again. Thanks to her intimate friend and schoolmate, Helen Manning, she knew much about Lawrence Knight, more than the gentleman had supposed.
"But tell me,"
she asked, curiously trembling with excitement,
"why is Mr. Lawrence Knight masquerading around here as the cowboy Honorable Patches?"
He answered earnestly, "I know it must seem strange to you, but the simple truth is that I became ashamed of myself and my life of idle uselessness. I determined to see if I could take my place among men simply as a man. I wanted to be accepted by men for myself, for my manhood, if you like, if not, and not because of my—" he hesitated and then said frankly, "because of my money and social position. I wanted to depend upon myself, to live as other men live, by my own strength and courage and work. If I had given my real name when I asked for work at the Cross Triangle, somebody would have found me out before too long, and my little experiment would have failed. Don't you see?" While he spoke, Kitty's excited mind had caught at many details. She believed sincerely that her girlhood love for Phil was dead. This man, even as Patches the cowboy, with a questionable shadow on his life, had compelled her respect and confidence, while in his evident education and social culture had won her deepest admiration. She felt that he was all that Phil was, and more. There was in her feeling toward him, as he offered himself to her now, no hint of the instinctive repulsion and abhorrence with which she had received Professor Parkhill's declaration of spiritual apathy. Her recent experience with the master of aesthetics had so outraged her womanly instincts that the inevitable reaction from her perplexed and troubled mind led her to feel more deeply and to be drawn more strongly towards this man with whom any woman might be proud to mate. At the same time, the attraction of the life which she knew he could give her, and for which she so longed so for passionately, with the relief of the thought that her parents would not need to sacrifice themselves for her, were potent factors in the power of Lawrence Knight's appeal.
"It'd be wonderful," she said musingly. "I've dreamed and dreamed about such things."
"You'll come with me, dear? You'll let me give you your heart's wish? You'll go with me into the life of which you're so fitted?"
"Do you really want me, Patches?"
she asked timidly, as though in her mind there was still a shadow of doubt. "More than anything in the world," he urged. "Say yes, Kitty. Say that you'll be my wife." The answer came softly, with a hint of questioning.
"Yes."
Kitty did not notice that the man had not spoken of his love for her. There were so many things for her to consider, so many other things to distract her mind. Nor did the man notice that Kitty herself had failed to speak in any way that little word which, rightly understood, holds in the fullest and deepest meaning All of life's happiness, of labor and accomplishment, of success and triumph, of sacrifice and sorrow, holds in its fullest and deepest meaning, indeed, all of life itself. End of chapter 14.